Chapter 20. Freedom at Last. Abolition of Slavery in the British Empire. Wilberforce and his friends hoped that when the slave trade was ended, the West Indian planters would treat their slaves more kindly, educate the children, and encourage happy family life, so that in time the slaves would become a free peasantry in much the same way as the European serfs had become free peasants. In the 10 years that followed the abolition of the Slave Trade Act of 1807, many efforts were made by the home government to improve the lot of slaves in the West Indies. But as we have seen, in the colonies, these efforts angered many of the planters and did more harm than good. In England itself, there was trouble. The Long War was over in 1815, but there was much unemployment and poverty. The workless men blamed the new machinery in the mills and factories. The hungry men blamed the corn laws, which prevented cheap corn being imported and thus made bread dear. There were riots, machinery was smashed, and corn ricks were burned. The government had too much to do keeping order at home to have time for dealing with slaves in distant islands. William Wilberforce was as keen as ever on the good work, but as he grew older, he was unable to stand the strain of long hours in the House of Commons. He felt he must look for a younger man to take his place when the time came for another fight on behalf of the slaves. Now that the trading in slaves was stopped, this fight would be the fight for freedom, for making slaves free men. He found a successor in Thomas Fowell Buxton. It would have been hard to find two men more unlike than Wilberforce and Buxton. Wilberforce was small, slender, and stooping, and was nicknamed the Shrimp. Buxton was so tall and broad that even at his school his companions called him Elephant Buxton. But both men were deeply religious, and Buxton, like Wilberforce, felt he could serve God best by being a member of Parliament and trying to bring in better laws to help his fellow men. His mother was a Quaker, so he had been taught from childhood to hate slavery. When in 1822 England had settled down again after the long wars and the troubles that followed them, Wilberforce and his friends felt the time had come to begin the battle to free the slaves. An anti-slavery society was formed and many important people joined. In March 1823, Wilberforce, in the House of Commons, presented a petition from the Quakers for the abolition of slavery itself. A few weeks later, Buxton made a long, bold speech declaring that slavery was against the principles of Christianity and of the British Constitution and should be gradually abolished throughout the British Empire. The Foreign Secretary George Canning declared that the British government wished and intended to do so in time, but it must be done gradually. It must be remembered that the abolition of slavery would mean a complete revolution in the social and industrial life of the West Indies, and the government thought the colonies, which had their own governments, should be given the chance of making these changes in their own way. Parliament could not take action in the matter until the great number of its members were convinced that slavery ought to be abolished. It took 10 years to convince them. Petitions were presented in Parliament demanding freedom for the slaves. Once more, the colonial assemblies were asked to take action. Only Nevis paid any heed. Then came another period of changes and difficulty in England. But the slaves were not forgotten. In 1830, William Wilberforce presided at a great meeting in London, which demanded immediate freedom. Still, the colonial assemblies were defiant. And as we have seen, Jamaica was faced with another rebellion when slaves broke loose, thinking they were being deceived by their masters and so robbed of their freedom. St. Lucia's storekeepers closed their shops for a week, and there was trouble on other islands. In London, the supporters of the planters and merchants placarded the walls of the city with bills in favor of slavery. When George Stephen, a friend of Wilberforce, discovered this, he had abolition bills printed and sent out a flying squad of bill posters to stick these bills on the top of the others before morning. In May 1833, soon after the meeting of the Great Reform Parliament of 1832, Lord Stanley, the colonial secretary, gave notice that the government intended to free all the slaves in the British Empire. Wilberforce was now a very sick man on his deathbed, but he was as eager as ever for news from the House of Commons, where the bill to free the slaves was being discussed. Buxton visited him every day to tell him how things were going. At last he was able to assure him that the bill would be passed, and that the British government had agreed to pay 20 million sterling to compensate the slave owners. "Thank God," cried Wilberforce, "that I should live to witness a day when the British government is willing to give 20 million sterling for the abolition of slavery." 4 days later, before the bill was actually passed, Wilberforce died. The Emancipation Bill to free the slaves in the British Empire was passed on August 28, 1833, and laid down that slavery should come to an end on the first day of August 1834. But for a few years, there was to be a period of apprenticeship. On that memorable Thursday, July 31st, 1834, the laborers returned from their work with the knowledge that the next morning they would no longer be slaves, but free men. After the evening meal, some climbed to the hilltops to wait for sunrise, the dawn of freedom. But thousands, dressed in their Sunday best, hastened to their churches and chapels, which had been decked with flowers, green boughs, and graceful palm fronds. They sang hymn after hymn with great feeling, and when midnight drew near, the congregations bowed in prayer, while their ministers stood watch in hand till the last minute had ticked away, and they could give the message, "You are free." Although no longer slaves, the laborers were to be apprentices for a time, and were expected to work for three-quarters of their time for their old masters. Some did not understand this. They left the plantations, and there was trouble before they could be persuaded to return to work. In Antigua, where the slaves had always been kindly treated, the Assembly decided not to adopt the apprenticeship plan, but to risk giving complete freedom at once. This proved a wise decision, and there was no trouble. The other islands found the apprentice plan would not work, and the time had to be reduced from 6 years to 4 years. So on August 1st, 1838, the slaves in the British Empire were completely free. The total number of slaves freed was 831,000. Of these, 715,000 were in the West Indies. In the West Indian islands belonging to other nations, slavery continued for some time. And as the produce of these islands could be sold more cheaply than that of the British islands, now paying wages to the laborers, the British planters thought it unfair. However, the French colonists freed their slaves in 1848 and the Danish in the same year, but only after a serious rising in St. Thomas. The Dutch freed their slaves in 1863 and the Spaniards in Puerto Rico in 1873. The slaves in Cuba were not all freed until 1886. In South America, slavery had come to an end by 1888. The United States had to fight a terrible civil war for 4 years between 1861 and 1865 before the slaves in the southern states were free.